Wow, what a great crowd this morning. Good to see everybody. There is a new sheet on the table, but I want to condition that the likelihood is we're going to have to break up what we're studying currently under lesson number 11, Relationships in the Church, because it's a big section. We've got a lot to cover, and I went into it when we published those notes and we had the outline at the very beginning. I knew that this would probably be a two-part lesson, and so if you look at the notes for chapter 11, they're front and back, and we'll cover the front side today about relationships, and then widows, we'll cover that. That's a huge part of chapter 5. And then we want to cover elders and what Paul says about elders beginning in about verse 17 of chapter 5, and then through chapter 6, verse 2 next week. Because we don't want to go so fast that we don't understand what he's saying, but those notes are on the back table just in case we're finished early next week and we can jump into the next lesson. So that's for lesson number 12. Lesson number 12, and that deals with that section down through about verse 10 where he talks about the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. So we'll talk about that maybe the next time, but definitely the time after that. But today we're in chapter 5. And both sets of these notes are on the back table. Chapter 11 notes are there if you need a copy of those. We'll leave those out for the next week. But let's turn to 1 Timothy chapter 5. And today we're going to look at verse 1 through verse 16. And then if we get done a little early with that, then we can launch a little bit into our discussion of what happens in verse 17. I want to start by reading this section, and then we'll go back and we'll discuss. But there's a lot. I hope there's some good discussion, especially about the widow's part. But let's begin in verse 1. Do not rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters, with all purity. Honor widows who are really widows. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. Now she who is really a widow and left alone trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. And these things command that they may be blameless. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, and not unless she has been the wife of one man, well reported for good works, if she's brought up children, if she's lodged strangers, if she's washed the saints' feet, if she's relieved the afflicted, if she's diligently followed every good work, but refuse the younger widows. For when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry, having condemnation because they've cast off their first faith. And besides, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. Therefore, I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully, for some have already turned aside after Satan. And if any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. Okay, so the first part is that generic part in verses 1 and 2 where he's talking about these different types of dynamics within a congregation. So here's question number 1, and this will get us through verses 1 and 2. Relationships are sometimes hindered in the church when age is viewed as a barrier. What is Paul's instruction about relationships in the church, and what are some practical ways that we can honor this? What do you think about verses 1 and 2 when he talks about exhorting older men as fathers, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters with all purity? What do you get out of that? Family aspect. Okay, Jenna said family. There's a lot of respect. It doesn't matter where you stand in a congregation, whether you're older, younger, whether you're an older woman or a younger woman. There's respect that's supposed to be shown. I think both of those are good points. Anything else? There's a place for everybody. That's a good point, Joel. Yes. Yeah. I want us to talk about that at the very end of this, because I think this is, and I think Joel's right, this is one of the failures of congregations, is we don't cultivate relationships that connect to the different age groups within a congregation. And generally you have older men who are one separate group and younger men who are another separate group, and they don't really touch each other in the sense of they're not connected. So I want to talk about that at the end and see if we can figure out ways to make that better. And the same with older women and younger women in the church. Bobby?
In industry, there's the sense of mentoring.
Yes.
Employees mentor the younger ones, and that's what you need to have in it.
Yeah. I even wrote that word down. I think that's an excellent idea. I wrote mentor down because I think that needs to happen in a congregation. Let's just start with what he's saying, right? Just the text, and then we'll work our way toward some applications, because I think I think it's been said a number of ways. This is a challenge for every congregation to make this work like Paul's talking about. So first of all, in verse 1, he says, do not rebuke an older man. The King James says elder here, but the idea is an older man. It's not necessarily an elder like the position in a church, but it would be an older man. Is he saying that if an older person sins in the church, you're not supposed to confront that older person about their sin? No. Then what's he saying? Don't despise their age. What should be our consideration as we approach them? Does our attitude matter? Does that respect, like you talked about, Bobby, does the respect we have for that person temper the approach that we have toward that person? And that's what he's talking about. So he says, don't rebuke an older man. So the attention now turns here to individuals, or maybe groups of individuals within a congregation, versus the whole congregation. Because up till this point in 1 Timothy, he's been talking about congregational activity, right? Worship in chapter 2 and some other things. Then he says, don't rebuke. And the word rebuke means to chide or to strike out, literally to beat up. Don't beat him up. Don't upbraid him. Literally, it means sharp castigation with words. Don't dice and slice him with words. And he's cautioning about the way that we would handle confrontation in the church, especially with older men or elderly men. The word is a similar word to what you get from the office of elders. It's not presbyteros, but it's a form of that word, but it's not the office of the elder here. Instead, he says you're supposed to exhort older men in the congregation as fathers. And the word exhort, I think, is probably the key here. What does it mean to exhort someone? Okay, it just means to encourage, right? So if he says, don't sharply castigate somebody, don't dice and slice him with your words, instead encourage him like you would a father. So before we go to an older man in the congregation, somebody who's garnered a lot of respect for a lifetime of service in a congregation, if they should be in sin, what should be a question we would ask in our mind? How would I talk to my own father about this? And if my own father would receive certain information in a certain way because, you know, he's been around and he's got all the experience and the wisdom, and I know that there's probably a certain way of approaching my own father, and then I probably want to use that same approach to an older man in the congregation. Would I use respect? And I would. Would I use tact and gentle words, knowing that harsh words bring up strife? Proverbs 15:1. Ash? Sure.
And sometimes younger people think that older people, that they're above that.
Right.
You know what I mean? That like, well, when I've been a Christian 30 years, I'll never sin then.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I didn't put that in my notes, but I think that's a great point. If you didn't hear what she was saying, does this passage show that even older members still struggle with sin? Is that a good thing for younger members of the church to know and to understand? If we present, and it's the same way with parents, right? I think every parent tries to do this. When you make a mistake, you try to be quick to apologize for it, and especially if you've done it with your kids, because you want your kids to know, even I can make mistakes, but here's how you deal with mistakes that you've made. Even if I'm wrong about something, I need to apologize. Try to apologize quickly for that because you want your kids to know. The same with older members of the church, because we do sometimes elevate older members of the church and say, it's like you've passed that Rubicon of being able to sin, but that's not true because even older members sin. I think that's a good thing to know. But we would want to talk to an older member of the church the same way, for example, an older man, the way that I would talk to my own father if he was in need of correction or caught in sin. I use respect and tact and gentle words. Now, that same exhortation applies to a couple of different groups, because when he says, but exhort him, that same exhortation is not only to the older men as fathers, but then what's the next category? Younger men, and how should they be addressed? As brothers, right? As brothers. Now, what does he mean as brothers? What's that telling us? Are younger members of the church, for example, a teenage boy who's obeyed the gospel, is he part of the church? Is he a brother? And when we talk to him, we should talk to him as a brother, right? And that's what he's calling on, is for us to be respectful. How would I talk to my brother or my sibling? Would the tone of my words matter? What about the words I choose? Would they matter in order to relate to that person? Or the place that I bring it up, because I'm trying to be tactful and respectful. But see, I'm supposed to use consideration to the younger men because they're my brothers in Christ. And so even if it was an older man talking to a younger brother in Christ, he's still my brother, and I've got to talk to him accordingly.
I think this also shows how important the home is.
Yes,
Because these are relationships you only learn within the home.
that's true.
To begin with.
That's right.
And we have so many broken homes now. Like you're saying, the younger men should treat the older men as fathers.
And you're right. Some people don't know what a father looks like because they've never had one. Yeah.
Siblings is not a good relationship. So,
Right.
it just shows how important even the home itself is.
That's right. 100%. And it matters because the home relates to the church. I think that's a good point. All right, what's the third category? Older women as mothers. Treat them as mothers. Does this mean that older women are exempt from correction? No. If they've sinned, they need to be encouraged as well. No one is exempt in a congregation. But we talk to them like we would talk to our own mother. We have to be gentle and respectful and tender, use humility, and maybe we do a little bit of soul searching before we talk to them because of our deep respect for that relationship. And then there's a fourth category that we exhort and encourage the same way. What's the fourth category? Younger women as sisters. We treat them as sisters. But then he adds a little bit to that, which I want to talk about in just a second. He says, as sisters. So again, how would we talk to our siblings? What voice would we use? What demeanor would we take? What tone? There obviously needs to be humility. And what tenderness would I use when approaching, for example, my sister? But he adds, there's a caveat there. What's the condition? With all purity. And that's attached to the younger women as to sisters. And the purity here means chastity or moral or spiritual purity. Is it the case that many men who maybe innocently go and try to counsel or talk to a younger woman end up in a mess after it's all over with? It's happened. I've seen preachers destroy their careers over something like that, or even just the insinuation of something. But I've seen a lot of people end up in a bad situation. A lot of men have been ruined by close counsel with young women in the church. And now Paul is saying, you treat them as sisters, but you be careful. You mind your purity when you're around that situation. You act appropriately in that situation. And by the way, what's an easy fix for that? Go to a public place, right, where there's no temptation, or take somebody with you. Especially if you're a man and you are married, you take your wife with you, and that can help that situation. But it's not wise to be caught in a situation like that. So Paul is encouraging that there have to be respectable relationships in the church. But when he says older men as fathers, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters, he is ultimately, in principle, talking about what relationships should look like in the church. And I agree with Joel, it often doesn't look like that in the church. And Jenna mentioned family, and Bobby mentioned, a couple of things. So here's the practical part of this. So moving away from just the idea of, confronting someone over sin and the way we would go about it. Let's get to the core of that, which is the relationships. How do we build better relationships between older men, younger men, older women, younger women, between men and women in the church? How do we build these relationships? What's a good way of doing that? Okay, teaching would solve a lot of it. Is time together outside of worship services important? Does time together in a worship service solve all the bonding that we need to have as a congregation? No, and we're busy in worship. We have things we're doing. We're before the throne of God. We've got our mind is here, and so slapping each other on the back coming in and shaking hands on the way out. And I believe we can genuinely love each other in doing that, and we can grow to know each other a little bit, but it doesn't really bond a congregation like it needs to be bound. And so that family relationship has to be present in order for us to have these kinds of relationships. It's only when we spend time together constantly that you end up with younger men growing close to those older men and getting attached to them, or younger women growing close to older women in the congregation. David, did I see your hand? And then
Yes, you did.
both Davids? Okay.
One thing that would help out a whole lot, and I'm guilty of it as well as everybody else here, that we need to, if somebody's sick, call and check on them.
Sure. Yeah,
Somebody needs help, call and check on them.
that's right.
I realize at times some people, you don't know how they're going to react, because some people don't want to be bothered.
Yeah.
But still, I think we should at least try.
And not only should we check on people who are sick should let us know they're sick so we can there has to be communication just in a congregation, and the more communication there is, the better off we're going to be. And then David?
I think our society as a whole tends to not have a general respect or appreciation
Sure.
for people of different age levels.
That's right.
Older to the younger,
That's right.
younger to the older. You see it in business and a lot of other
Mhm.
places. If the church was different, where you walked in and no matter who you were, what age you were, the older people, the younger people, everybody treat each other like
That's right.
we respect them as a human being rather than they're not as important because they're not that age or not old enough or too old.
Right.
And if we had that kind of thing going on, it would be different. We'd be stronger.
Yeah. And there's always room for improvement. But I do love seeing when you'll have kids in the congregation run up and hug older members of the church here. I love seeing that. And I love that some of the older men in the congregation have taken a real interest in some of the younger boys, and they play with them and they'll take them to do things. I think that's a great thing, because especially younger people, as they grow up, they want counsel. And if there's really strong relationships with older members in the church, then who might they turn to for counsel? Those folks, been there and done that, and they'll get good advice from that. Bobby mentioned mentor programs. Is there anything wrong in a congregation with, and I say this in quotes, obviously, is there anything wrong with adopting members of the church and just taking them in? And for example, older members of the church adopting somebody, you say, you know what? We're going to adopt that person, in the sense of we're going to have them in a home. We're going to do things with them, and all of a sudden there's a bond that's created. I think that's a good thing. But we need to be in each other's homes and out eating and doing things with each other. I just think we need to do it. I just think too often the tendency is to pop in and out of assemblies with no real connections in a congregation. We don't know each other, and when we don't know each other, we don't encourage each other. And that's what Paul is encouraging here, that we encourage each other and be respectful in the way we do it, but that respect can't exist unless those relationships exist in the church. Any other thought on that before we get into widows? Yeah, Tom?
I had an opportunity at one time to go see an old gentleman in the hospital, and I got to talking to him, and all of a sudden he just opened up. He was a World War II veteran, and he, for some reason, just decided he was going to tell me his life story, which he did. And I ran and got pencil and paper and wrote it all down, and actually published it, if you want to call it that. And I could tell he was highly appreciative of that, and his family was appreciative of it.
Sure.
because He told me things that they didn't know.
Right. And not only was he benefited by your being there so he could open up, but you're benefited too. And I think that's always the case, that if we just carve some time out and we actually invest in each other, everybody gets the benefit of that relationship. And then I think it fosters what we're talking about here in verses 1 and 2, the ability to talk to each other sometimes deeply about things that we need to improve on. All right, so let's get to number 2. This is a pretty big section, but I think we're going to try to break it down where it makes sense. So number 2, how does Paul categorize widows in the church? Verses 3 through 16. What widows are we authorized to help, and which ones should not be helped, and why? And then how do you think the church has handled the issue of widows historically? What do you think about this? Do you think that our approach to widows is sometimes what Paul is talking about right here with consideration to these things? Are there some conditions that limit actually who we can help as a widow in this passage? All right, so let's start in verse 3. The first word he uses is the word honor. Honor widows who are really widows. In what sense is Paul using that word honor? Okay, respect. Because he just talked about respect, so I do think respect is involved in it. Do you think anything else is involved here in honor? Do you think it could mean financial assistance? And drop down and notice in verse 4, when he gets to the next one, he says, "But if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first show piety at home and to repay their parents." Now, if you take the piety and the repayment of the parents and you connect that to the honor, then what does honor talk about? Financial support of widows. And by the way, real quick, just for next week, drop over to verse 17. "Let the elders who rule well be counted worthy of double honor." If the honor in verse 3 is material financial support, what's the honor for elders in verse 17? It's the same. I want to talk about that. There's a huge thing sometimes we miss when he gets to elders in verse 17. So that's a food for thought next week. Ash?
Just about the money thing, I was going to say, in the King James in verse 3, it says, honor widows that are widows indeed.
Yes.
It's got an aside on the second widows that says destitute.
Yes.
So honor widows that are
Destitute. Yep.
indeed.
Yep. All right, so the first thing is to honor. And the word carries the meaning of to value at a price. To value at a price. So Paul's certainly talking about financial assistance of widows, which every congregation hopefully is invested in and wants to do. You want to help widows in their desperation. And for widows who are deprived or bereft, and I think that translation is there. It's widows who are widows indeed, widows who are without assistance. So Paul says, honor those who are truly widows, who are really widows. A widow indeed is a widow who has nothing of her own and no help on her own. So he's now going to explain in all the remaining verses what he means by a widow indeed, because the fact is, some widows are not widows indeed. That's a fact. Not every widow is able to be helped by the church, so he's going to explain that. So his first category is, number 1, widows that have living children or living family members. That's verse 4. So what's the argument of Paul in verse 4? If any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. If a widow has family, who should her support come from? It must come from family. If she has living relatives, her support should come from them. Now, he offers 2 categories here in verse 4. He says, her children, and then New King James has grandchildren, but grandchildren is a pretty generic term. Grandchildren literally just means descendants or relatives. The idea would be that she has relatives in the family who could do this, or she has children, her own children who could do this. But the point Paul makes is that piety starts right there. Piety starts there. The word piety means dutiful, to show duty. And in what way do they show duty? It's by repaying their parents. So it is good and acceptable to God. It is His will that widows with family receive their assistance from family. Now, while we're here, let's add a verse or 2 to that. Drop down to verse 8. Here's another connecting verse to this. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he's denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So now he's talking about those in verse 4 when he says, if she has children or grandchildren, now he's talking about those folks in the home that should be supporting the widow. And what is Paul's inspired commentary on a person who should be supporting his aged grandmother or his mother? What's his point? What do you think, Joel? I'll show your hand.
I was just thinking, unfortunately, in today's world, you have those that will not.
Won't do it.
Will not.
That's right.
That leaves the poor widow stranded.
Yes.
She may not be a widow indeed because she may have children and grandchildren, but yet if they provide zero support,
Yep.
what do you turn to?
Yep. But here's and this is what Joel's talking about. Some won't do it. If they refuse to do it, then what have they done? First of all, they've denied the faith. How are they denying the faith? Because God said that's what you should do, right? Because remember, Jesus even addressed that situation when the Pharisees came to him and they said, you're causing your disciples to break tradition. That's in Mark 7 and Matthew 15. And Jesus said, you are actually breaking the law of God, and his example of the breach of the law of God is not taking care of their aged parents, because they were calling Corban, right? They were saying all of our money is devoted to God, and we can't use it to help our parents. And Jesus said, you're violating the law in doing that. It is God's will that family members help their aging family members, and when they won't do it, they've denied the faith. Art?
The Old Testament is pretty clear about that.
Yes, he was. Yes, it was. Absolutely, it was. Yeah, it was all over the law of Moses, and the principle still is here under the new covenant today. So a person who won't do that has denied the faith, and Paul says they're worse than what? They're worse than an unbeliever. Now, how could that be the case? Okay, his point is even pagans take care of their aging parents, and for a person to act like that is to be worse than a pagan. You can kind of see an example of that in Matthew 5 when Jesus was talking about, how you should love your enemies. And he talks about how do not even the publicans the same, and do not even the Pharisees the same, how they love their own. The principle is even sinners act with more respect to their family members sometimes than Christians do. And then drop down and add verse 16, because verse 16 goes with this. If any believing man or woman has widows, then what's their responsibility? You relieve them. You provide for them, and do not let the church be burdened that it may relieve those who are really widows indeed. So what's the purpose of family members stepping in and helping their own family members? What are they trying to do? They're helping the widows, but they're helping take the burden off of the church so the church can actually help those who really need the help, like Joel said, because they are desperate. They're destitute. Any thoughts on that? It's very clear. It's very plain. And if someone should say, well, but it might put financial strain on me, then shame on us for thinking that. Because while you were a baby and you needed somebody to take care of you 24 hours a day, those people who are now widows were doing that for you. And it's just part of life, the cycle of life, that when your parents grow aged and they need help after they've given you a lifetime of it, then you owe it to them to do that. And it's a terrible thing. Like Joel was saying, I think it's a terrible thing. Well, we see it all the time, where somebody gets up and their parents are aged and they want the least amount of involvement with their family. They don't want to support them financially. They don't want to help them pay their bills. They don't want to help them with their medical expenses or doctor's appointments or whatever. They just want to be hands off and let somebody else do that. And the Bible said you're in trouble if you do that. It is God's will that we help our aging family members do that. Any thoughts on that? Yeah, Chris? And then Dad, Chris?
So the idea, right now we live in a society where, retirement is a thing, and we have workplaces provide retirement accounts, pensions, 401ks and stuff. That's not how it used to be. Used to you worked, and when you couldn't work anymore, your family took care of you.
Yes.
Back in, the late 19th
Yep.
this idea of retirement came around. So, even in our society, a long time ago, that's how we just took care of our older family.
Yes. And we should be as willing to step in and help them now if need be. Dad, you were going to say something? Tender subject. And it is. It's sad. What is tragic is you can have a household of many family members, And sometimes that burden falls to one family member. They're the only one who's willing to do it, and by themselves they can hardly do it. I saw another couple of hands, Barry and then Gloria.
How does that look, or how does that work for a parent that doesn't have a relationship?
Yep. Yeah. And that's why, and I think it goes back earlier, building that family relationship is really important, and sometimes relationships are severed. I know. I don't know, because are they then destitute because they have no one to help in that situation? I don't know. I think there might have probably some judgment involved in that. Gloria?
I was just gonna say, you talked about financially helping them, but there's a lot of other things that they need as well. They need to be taken care of,
That's right.
taken places.
That's right.
Need to go to the doctors with them. I mean, there's just all sorts of ways to help besides just.
Yeah.
And it's really sad when we go to places like Martin Boyd and you have somebody that's a resident there that never gets a visitor.
Never-
Nobody ever comes to see them.
Yep.
They're just all alone.
All alone. Yeah. We see it happen quite a bit. That's what Barry's talking about. With the kids just are out. They're out of the picture. If they're members of the church, I think there's some serious training that needs to take place. There's that goes back to the exhortation earlier. They need to be confronted. They need to be told, hey, this is your responsibility. Your aging parent is your responsibility. I don't know what you do with non-Christians, but
I think too maybe what Barry's saying too though is, what if the parents have hurt these
yes,
So then you're
it's a self-inflicted wound. They've.
because a lot of people aren't blessed with good people.
That's true. Yeah.
Their parents did bad things
Yeah.
to them, and they severed that
Yeah.
relationship. However, if the children are Christians, then how does that work for this?
Yeah.
When your parent hurts you in a terrible way,
Yeah.
what then is your responsibility as a Christian to them when they're
I understand. But then agape love is not circumstantial, right? But the Lord treats us better than we deserve to be treated, and I think that same affection goes backward. We treat people better than they deserve to be treated, especially if they don't deserve to be treated the way that they're being treated. So it's tough. This is a very emotional, very tough subject. But there are plenty of people who are widows that fall into the category of, generically speaking, they've got people that can help them, and those people should be helping them to take the burden off of the church. Now, here's the second category. There are some who, in verse 5, don't have help. This gets back to the original of widows indeed. Notice in verse 5 he said, now she who is really a widow and left alone trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. So she's without help. She's alone. She doesn't have the family to help her. There's no children or family or relatives. Her only hope is God. That's what her substance of her life is. But she has nothing here materially, just the hope she has in God, and she presents her supplications and her needs to God continually. That is a widow indeed, one the church bears responsibility toward because she is desolate in that situation. But even if she doesn't have family, and notice in verse 6, if she lives in pleasure, she is dead while she lives. Is it possible for a person to be a widow indeed, but to live a riotous life, to live in sin? And all of a sudden now it's not the same situation. And there perhaps is here a reference to first century practice that many people who are widowed, many women who are widowed, went sometimes into what profession do you think? Prostitution. And Paul said that's a game changer. Now you've got a game changer, and the church is not to help unfaithful widows. We're supposed to help faithful people. Now, with a couple minutes we've got left. Now in verse 9, and then that goes, we covered, verse 7, he says, you command these things and teach. We covered verse 8. So then he gets down to verse 9, and he talks about there are some who are under 60 years of age in verse 9. So it says, younger widows in verse 9 are not to be helped, even though they are widows indeed, right? They might be a legitimate widow, but they are not to be helped. And the explanation for verse 9, when he says, do not let a widow under 60 years be taken into the number, he explains it beginning in verse 11. But refuse younger widows, for when they begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry, having condemnation because they cast off their first faith. Besides, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, not only idle, but gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. Therefore, I desire that younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully. Some have already turned aside to Satan. So he talks about how in their youthfulness, under 60 years of age, for example, in verse 11, they might have strong physical, even sexual desires that might end up alienating them from Christ, but they also desire remarriage at a young age. And in verse 12, their unrestrained desires can lead them to apostasy, which is a really sort of a secondary point there, but there's a really good point that strong desire can lead people to make bad choices, even sometimes in a spouse. They desire marriage so much that they just pick a rascal to marry, and that ends up happening sometimes. Or they develop the habit of idleness in verse 13. They wander from house to house, socializing, not working, gossiping and meddling in people's business, spreading rumors, giving away secrets, saying things which they ought not. And to avoid this, Paul says, get married, bear children, manage the home, meaning they ought to be involved in things that are good for them and good for the church. That it's better to give oneself in the duties of family than to have strong desires and to be alone. Any thoughts on the younger widows there? Okay? And obviously in verse 15, some were already demonstrating qualities like that. Now, Paul goes through a list of things beginning in verse 9 and in verse 10 about the widow indeed, about how she has been the husband of one wife. She was a married woman. Now she's not. Well reported for good work. She's brought up children, lodged strangers. She's washed the saints' feet. In other words, she's helped Christians and non-Christians. She's relieved the afflicted. She's diligently followed every good work. This means that she, in her life, has shown she is faithful, and you help faithful people in the church. Having led a life of faithful service, no one in the congregation would deny that she was worthy of that kind of support because she's been so faithful. Now, historically, really quick with like the minute we have left, do you think that we've been good in doing this? And how can we fix where we've been wrong at it? What's your thoughts? Why have, and I think we do pretty good. I think the elders are pretty mindful of the widows of the congregation. But historically, when widows kind of fall through the cracks, why do they fall through the cracks? What's going on? I mean, why? Well, a lot of times we don't, and so that's part of the problem. Sometimes, if a widow has need, is there anything wrong with going to the elders and saying, look, I'm really struggling right now? There's nothing wrong with that. She should do that. Lack of support from families, like Barry was talking about, I think that's been part of the problem. I think there's also the belief in the congregation that every single widow must be helped. And Paul said some can't be helped, some shouldn't be helped. When widows don't come to the church for help, that's a problem. And do you think it all goes back to the beginning? If we knew each other like older women as mothers and older men as fathers and younger men as brothers and younger men as, or younger sisters as younger women as sisters, if we knew each other like that, if a need came up, would we know it? I think we would. Tom and then Gene, and we'll have to end. Go ahead, Tom.
Don't you think there's a perfect example of that when the church?
Yeah, Acts 6, I think, is a great example of that. Yeah, perfect example. And for the same reasons that the apostles didn't get stuck doing that and their mission was hindered in some way. Gene?
Well, this all goes back to how it started out, how we're to treat
Yes.
one another. I have been in a congregation where the elders had classes both for young and old
All right.
on how to manage their money.
Right.
And I learned a lot. I took
Yeah.
one of those classes with one of my daughters.
Was the class free?
Was it free?
Free of charge?
Yeah, well, the church paid for it. but you-
No, I was just joking. I was like, somebody made some money on that class. No, that's okay. Yeah, but see, classes like that are really good. They're very practical and such. Next week, I want you to entertain this question. Can elders be paid? And we'll talk about that. Beginning in verse 17. Take a look at those notes if you haven't already. We'll cover that, and we'll cover employee-employee relationships in chapter 6. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.